No one expected the Silverback to return, especially not for her, especially not now. The forest was quiet that morning, not peaceful, but watchful, as if every branch held its breath, as if every leaf knew something sacred was about to break. She was alone, exiled, curled beneath the twisted roots of a strangler fig. Her body shivered, not from cold, but from the weight of pain and instinct. The labor had started before sunrise. There had been no one to notice, no one to help. Only the wind, the earth, and the ache of bringing life into a world that had already turned its back on her. She had been part of the troop once, not loved, but accepted, until the new matriarch arrived, until politics older than memory played out in whispers and glances, until her belly began to swell and the others began to turn away. Now she was a shadow, a ghost among trees, and she was giving birth in silence. The first infant came quickly, the second slower, the third still, small, and too quiet. She cradled them all, held them close with trembling arms. Above her, the canopy shifted. Somewhere, a monkey screeched. She didn't look up. Her world had shrunk to the tiny chest rising against hers. 3 heartbeats, 3 chances, and no one to help her keep them alive, until the footsteps came, slow, heavy, deliberate. She knew that rhythm, had once breathed with it, had once feared it, and now, after all this time, it was back. She didn't move, didn't dare. The Silverback stepped into the clearing like a storm held in skin, massive, scarred. His presence bent the air. His gaze found her, not as a rival, not as a threat, but as something he had once chosen and left. And now he was here again, not to lead, not to reclaim, but to witness. His eyes dropped to the infant's, then rose to her face. She couldn't read his expression, but she felt it. And for the first time in seasons, she didn't feel alone. The jungle didn't breathe. Even the wind stayed still. And in that quiet, something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not apology, something older, recognition. She had brought life into the world, and somehow, he had returned to carry part of it forward. The day had only just begun, but the story, the real story, had waited for this moment, and it would not be quiet much longer. He didn't approach, not at first, just stood in the golden spill of sunlight, watching her as though trying to decide whether this was a moment to belong to or merely remember. The air between them was taut with old wounds and something resembling hope. When he finally moved, it wasn't toward her. It was toward the edge of the clearing, where the foliage grew thick and tangled. With deliberate grace, he began pulling vines aside, clearing a path, not just for her, but for what she had become. A mother, a bearer of the troop's future. She watched him without blinking. The infants stirred, soft sounds escaping their tiny mouths. One clung instinctively to her fur. Another reached an arm into the open air, toward the figure in the clearing. The Silverback saw, and this time he stepped closer. Still no sound, still no claim, only action. He dropped to one knee, a posture of presence, not dominance, and placed something between them. A handful of leaves, freshly picked, a peace offering, a memory of when he used to bring her food, long before the silence. Her eyes welled, not with tears, but with something heavier. A memory returned, a recognition confirmed. He wasn't here for power, he was here to stay. The jungle resumed its breath. Birds chirped again. A breeze stirred the canopy. And beneath the fig tree, among new life and second chances, exile turned to belonging once more. Days passed. He didn't leave. Each morning, he brought something new. Roots, berries, moss soaked with dew. Not just for her, but for the tiny mouths she fed with quiet desperation. He didn't touch them. He never intruded. But he stayed close enough that she could rest for moments at a time, her eyes drifting closed in the safety his presence offered. He stood guard through the nights, massive silhouette outlined against the moonlit brush. When predators howled in the distance, he answered with a low, thunderous rumble that shook the very bark of the trees. And slowly the jungle began to listen. One by one, members of the troop began to appear along the outer trees, At first curious, then uncertain. The matriarch did not come, but others, younger and unsure, lingered. They watched how he protected the exiled one, how the infant squirmed beneath the folds of her arms, how the mother did not shrink anymore. She had stopped flinching. She had begun standing, and he, once silent, began to make sounds again. Low grunts, gentle huffs, the music of leadership, but not for dominance, for stability. The forest began to remember him not as the silverback who left, but as the one who returned. And with him, something larger returned as well. Trust, rhythm, family. It would take time. But even in the heart of the wild, time bows to love that stays. The infants grew stronger, their cries sharper, their eyes more curious. Each day brought new movements, new sounds, tiny hands reaching for bark, teeth testing moss, little feet pressing uncertain steps into the earth. And always the silverback was there, a sentinel in silence, a shadow that warmed rather than loomed. She began to move beyond the fig tree, not far, not yet, but far enough, to teach, to forage, to show her children how to listen to the wind, how to read the shadows. He followed, not in front, never leading, but beside, like rhythm, like a memory that refused to fade. One morning she paused on the ridge above the clearing. Below, the troop had gathered, not all, but more than she'd seen in a season. The young ones played in the underbrush, older ones watched with cautious interest, and at their edge the silverback stood. She didn't descend immediately. Instead, she turned to her children. Let them see. Let them decide. And when they tumbled forward, fearless, joyful, she followed. The path she had been pushed from was still there, and though the trees had changed, the roots remembered. That day the troop made no sound, no challenge, no embrace, but they did not turn away. And in the wild, that is how home begins again. It wasn't instant. Acceptance never is. But each day after, the space she occupied grew a little less narrow. Where once there was avoidance, now there was silent acknowledgement. A shared glance, a lingering scent trail not swept away. The silverback never reclaimed the center of the group. He didn't need to. His leadership was quieter now, measured not in power, but in presence. He sat where he was needed, walked when the group moved, waited when she did. The infants, once hidden, now tumbled freely across the brush, their squeals weaving through the air like music. One of them began to mimic his stance, broad arms, puffed chest, until the others fell over in laughter. He didn't correct them. He simply watched, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. The fig tree remained. They never returned to it, but she visited it sometimes, alone. She would sit where the roots still bore the impressions of that long, painful night. Not in mourning, in reverence, for what had been lost, for what had survived. And as the rains returned and the forest thickened with green, the troop moved as one, not perfectly, but together, because the wild had remembered something it nearly forgot. That healing doesn't begin in strength, it begins in stillness, in choosing to stay, in learning to listen, and in returning, not for what was, but for what could still be. The season shifted again, the canopy thickened, and the calls of young ones echoed further into the valley. Her children grew bold, climbing higher, playing longer, venturing out of her reach with confidence she had only dreamed of for them. He remained near, never hovering, always watching. When the youngest tripped and tumbled into leaves, it was he who extended a steady arm, not to lift, but to offer balance. When danger stirred in the distance, it was his low growl that silenced the forest. She watched this not with surprise, but with stillness, a knowing, for what had once been fractured now moved like a whole, not mended, but grown around the break. And others noticed. The troop no longer avoided her path. They listened when she led a foraging line. They gathered when her eldest let out its first warning call. Respect, once withheld, returned, not as ceremony, but as instinct. And when she stood in the clearing one morning, sun washing over her back, and the silverback came to stand beside her, not in front, not behind, there was nothing to say, because it was clear to all. The past had shaped them, but the future would be theirs to shape together, and shape it they did. Seasons passed, and what had once been silence became rhythm. The troop no longer hesitated when she called. Her voice, once ignored or drowned out, carried a tone now familiar, steadfast, calm, commanding without force. Mothers let their young follow her children. Males deferred to her in moments of tension. Even the elders began to echo her patterns. The Silverback never sought praise, but he watched always. Not possessively, but protectively, as if ensuring that the weight she now carried would never again fall only on her shoulders. The fig tree remained untouched, a sacred place they all seemed to sense without words. The children called it the quiet tree. They played near it, but never climbed it. They knew, somehow, that it was where their beginning had been sealed in silence. And then one afternoon, something changed. A storm swept through the valley, trees split, rocks shifted, and when the rain subsided, a section of the high ridge gave way. A mudslide crept dangerously close to the lower dens. She was the first to respond. Without hesitation, she gathered the young and guided them uphill. The Silverback followed, rallying the adults behind her. Together they worked, carrying, clearing, stabilizing. And when it was over, not a single life had been lost. That night, as the forest cooled and the troop huddled in a new, higher grove, the Silverback rested beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. And neither did she. Because leadership wasn't about noise. It was about presence. And in that moment, wet, tired, but whole, they sat beneath the stars, not as exiles, not as survivors, but as the ones who remembered what it took to begin again. In the days that followed, balance returned. Not the same as before, but something wiser. The troop no longer moved with the unspoken fear of collapse. Instead, they moved with memory. The young ones listened when she called. They looked to the Silverback before venturing too far. There was no hierarchy drawn in bark or stone, but there was structure, formed not from dominance, but from trust. One of her sons began mimicking the Silverback's movements, not to challenge, but to understand. The elder gorilla allowed it. When the child stumbled in an exaggerated stance, the Silverback grunted softly and reached down, not to correct, but to steady. It was in these small exchanges that the future was shaped. When a neighboring troop appeared at the fringe of their territory, it was she who approached first, calm, upright, flanked by her children. The Silverback followed a pace behind, visible, grounded, but no longer the only shield they relied upon. No aggression came from the others, only curiosity, and eventually distance became respect. That night, as twilight melted into the dark, she sat at the edge of the grove and listened, not for threats, but for rhythm. She heard her children breathing. She heard branches creaking where young ones climbed. She heard the Silverback's slow exhale behind her. Everything she'd once lost had returned, not in the way she imagined, but in the way that mattered, through growth, through stillness, through the silent choosing to stay, to stand, to care. And in the soft soil beneath her palms, she pressed her fingers into the earth, not to cling, but to anchor. Because the wild had changed, and so had she. They say the forest remembers what we forget. And in the rustling of leaves and the hush between raindrops, it told her story again and again, until even those who hadn't lived it felt it. The young ones carried it in their movements, mimicking not just the posture of the Silverback or the foraging calls of the mother, but something deeper, the patience of waiting, the strength in quiet loyalty, the bravery in returning. One evening, as mist crept through the underbrush and fireflies blinked like slow thoughts, the Silverback remained at the edge of the grove, not out of reluctance but reverence. He watched the mother's daughter teach her own young, where the cool water pooled after a storm. He saw her sons lead the smaller ones across vines he once had to guard. He saw the echoes of himself in them, and he saw her, no longer exiled, no longer surviving. She stood tall in the golden light, her presence no longer questioned, no longer doubted, and when their eyes met across the glade, there was no past between them anymore. Only the now, only the truth they had shaped with time, with tenderness, with choosing, again and again, to stay. The forest did not need to speak. It had already listened, and in listening, it had healed, as had they. By the time the rains came again, heavier, slower, more forgiving, her fur had grayed around the edges. Her children had children of their own, and their voices echoed higher in the canopy. She no longer climbed with the same grace, but when she moved, others parted for her without needing to be told. The silverback, older still, spent more time beneath the shaded trees. He no longer roared. He no longer had to. His presence had become the very rhythm of the place, steady, enduring. And though neither of them led with noise or command, they shaped every path the troop walked. One morning, the youngest of the group, no older than a season, tumbled too close to the old fig tree. Startled, it cried out, expecting punishment, exile, silence. But she approached with quiet feet. She sat beside the little one, and with a hand weathered by time, she pointed to the roots. "Here," she seemed to say, "this is where we begin." The others gathered behind her, not to correct, but to remember, and the forest with its rustling breath marked the moment, not as an end, but as another beginning. From that day forward, the fig tree was no longer just the place where silence once reigned. It became a space of quiet gathering, a natural sanctuary where generations paused, listened, and passed on more than instincts. They passed on knowing. During the dry season, when food grew scarce and tempers short, it was her steady guidance that held the troop together. Her calm reminded them that panic had no place where memory lived. And when the rains returned, washing over the moss-covered stones and filling the hidden streams, the silverback would often sit near the edge of camp, his back to the sunrise, watching, not as a ruler, but as a witness. Together, they had reshaped what it meant to lead, not from above, but from among. And so the young played more freely, the old rested more easily. And in the space between generations, legacy moved, not in stories carved on trees, but in choices made again and again to protect what was quiet, what was patient, what was home. There were no ceremonies in the forest, no titles passed, no crowns bestowed. But when she no longer rose with the sun, when her steps grew slower than the smallest of her grandchildren, the troop noticed, the silverback still sat with her, still brought her fruit, still shared his quiet presence. But now it was her daughter who led foraging paths, her son who watched from high branches. Her legacy was no longer just story, it was structure. One morning, a young male approached the fig tree alone. He sat in its shade, not to play, but to listen. He didn't speak. But when the wind stirred the canopy above, he lifted his head as if to answer. And though she didn't rise to meet him, she smiled. Because something inside her knew the forest would keep going, and her story, wrapped in bark and breath, would move with it. She had once been forgotten. Now she had become part of what would never be. And in the following season, as storms came heavier and food moved farther between the hills, it was her name, spoken not in language, but in gesture, that steadied the troop. The youngest mimicked how she used to press her palm against the ground before choosing a path. Others remembered how she had waited before crossing streams, not out of hesitation, but out of respect. These habits became rituals. These rituals became rhythm. She spent her final weeks beneath the fig tree, not out of weakness, but by choice. It was the place where she had once become a mother, where she had once been seen again, and where silence had once returned her to the world. Each morning, someone came to sit beside her. Sometimes it was her daughter, sometimes a grandchild, sometimes the silverback, now moving only when necessary, always with reverence. None of them asked anything of her, they simply came. And when one morning she did not wake, they did not cry out, they did not wail, they sat in stillness, in the way she had taught them. And when they rose, they left no marker, no stone, only the space beneath the fig tree, untrampled, untouched, preserved. Because remembrance, like the forest, needs no monument, only presence. And yet her presence lingered, in the way the wind curved around the fig tree, in the hush that fell each dusk when the youngest paused before playing, in the small stones carefully lined in arcs by the stream, placed not for ceremony, but because she once did. One of her great-granddaughters, barely weaned, began resting her hand on the earth before moving through brush. The others watched her with quiet wonder. No one taught her this. She simply knew. And the silverback, now slower, now quieter, began each morning seated near the fig tree, sometimes alone, sometimes joined. He no longer moved as protector, but as memory made flesh. His body carried years, but his gaze still held her. When a new infant was born, a daughter to the daughter of her daughter, the mother laid the newborn not at the center of the troop, but at the base of the fig tree. Just for a moment, the infant blinked upward. A leaf fell, the forest hushed, and in that stillness, the troop watched, not with fear or grief or ritual, but with knowing. The story was not over. It was simply beginning again. She had been cast out, alone, afraid, and heavy with life. Now her presence shaped generations. The troop no longer remembered the moment she was pushed aside, but they all knew the rhythm she taught them. Through her silence, they had learned to listen. Through her patience, they had learned to lead. And the silverback, who once left and returned, had anchored them in something stronger than tradition: trust. Together, they rebuilt not just structure, but meaning. They did not reclaim the past. They grew around it. This was not just survival. This was healing. And in the quiet grove, where the first cries of her children once echoed in exile, there now stood something more enduring than memory: belonging. Years later, long after the silverback's seat at the fig tree grew empty, and the last of her children had grayed at the temples, the grove remained. New generations came, playful, wild, and unaware of exile or return. But they moved through the trees with a rhythm they didn't invent. They paused in places they had never been taught to honor. They looked to the fig tree not for answers, but for something deeper, grounding. And sometimes, when dust stretched long and golden across the canopy, the leaves would shift in a windless hush, as if breathless, as if watching. No stories were spoken aloud, no names repeated, but in every footfall, in every choice to stay, to care, to lead, not from above, but from among, she remained, not in shadow, but in rhythm. And the forest, timeless and listening, held her still. If this story touched you, let its rhythm continue. Like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that echo the longest.